The silence in the chrome steel chamber was a physical weight. It pressed on Elian's skin, cold and absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, strained hum of the general's containment field. Blue-white light bled from recessed strips along the floor and ceiling, stripping the world of color, leaving only stark geometry and the man at its center. General Kalen Varus was a monument to controlled violence, even in repose. He sat on the edge of the sterile plinth, his uniform a slash of obsidian against the pale metal, his head bowed. The tremors that racked his frame were the only sign of the storm raging within him, a psychic backlash from the orbital insertion over Xylos. 1,000 minds, screaming in the digital ether of the Legion's neural network, still echoed in his skull. The victory had been absolute. The cost was this. Elian stood just inside the sealed doorway, his own regulation graze, making him a ghost in the periphery. He waited. He was not permitted to speak until addressed. He was not a person in this room. He was a function, a tool brought in to soothe the primary asset. The air tasted of ozone and sterile filtration, a scent he had come to associate with the general's pain. A bead of sweat traced a path down his temple, cold in the refrigerated air. He did not wipe it away. He remained perfectly still, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, his gaze fixed on a point on the floor just to the left of the general's polished boots. He had learned early that direct eye contact was a catalyst. It was an intimacy the general's ravaged senses could not tolerate in these moments. The tremors worsened. A low growl, more vibration than sound, vibrated through the deck plates. It was the sound of a man's mind tearing itself apart. "Regulator," a voice from the comm panel by the door stated, clipped and impersonal. It was Director Valerius's aide. "Proceed." That was his cue. Elian took a slow, measured breath, the recycled air doing little to calm the frantic beating of his own heart. He moved forward, his soft-soled shoes making no sound on the polished floor. Each step was a deliberate act of will, a walk toward the epicenter of a hurricane contained in flesh and bone. He stopped precisely 3 feet from the general, the regulation distance. He could feel the chaotic energy radiating from him now, a palpable static that made the fine hairs on his arms stand on end. It felt like standing too close to a failing power conduit, a dangerous thrum that promised a violent discharge. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, centering himself, becoming what they needed him to be. A void. A null space. He did not have psychic abilities. He had the opposite. A complete and utter absence of them. A genetic anomaly that made his mind a black hole for the energies that conductors like Kalen wielded. He reached out, not with his hand, but with that innate silence. He let the quiet of his consciousness expand, a gentle, inexorable tide rolling in to meet the general's psychic tsunami. Kalen's head snapped up. His eyes, the color of storm-darkened silver, were unfocused, pupils dilated to black pools of agony. A line of blood trickled from one nostril, a stark crimson against the pallor of his skin. His jaw was clenched so tightly that the muscles in his neck stood out like steel cables. He saw Elian, but not as a man. He saw a sanctuary, a silence in the unending, screaming noise. "Closer," Kalen rasped, the word broken, forced from a throat raw with strain. Elian hesitated. Protocol was clear, 3 feet. To move closer was a breach, an unauthorized intimacy that would be noted, logged, and questioned. He could feel the unseen eyes of the observation cameras, the biometric sensors tracking his heart rate, his respiration. They were always watching. But the command in the general's voice was not that of an officer to a subordinate. It was the desperate plea of a drowning man. He took another step, and another. He stopped when his knees were inches from the general's. He slowly, deliberately, knelt. The cold of the floor seeped through the thin fabric of his trousers. He lowered his gaze, focusing on the tightly clenched fists in the general's lap. The knuckles were white. The tremors were beginning to subside, the violent shudders smoothing into a low-frequency vibration. The psychic static in the air lessened, the pressure against Elian's mind receding. He could breathe again. He remained kneeling, a silent supplicant before a broken god, his very presence a balm. The minutes stretched into an eternity, marked only by the slow, steady hum of the containment field and the ragged sound of the general's breathing, evening out. The silence in the room was no longer a weight. It was a shared space, a fragile piece they had built together in the ruins of a battle fought light years away. Finally, the tension in Kalen's frame dissipated, his shoulders slumping. He lifted a hand, the movement no longer jerky but weary, heavy. His fingers, long and scarred, brushed against Elian's cheek. The touch was feather-light, yet it sent a jolt through Elian's entire body. It was a profound breach of every rule that governed their existence. It was a touch that acknowledged him not as a regulator, not as an asset, but as a person. Kalen's thumb stroked his skin once, a rough, calloused motion. His silver eyes were clear now, focused, and filled with an exhaustion so deep it seemed ancient. The blood on his face was the only remnant of the storm. "You're the only one," he murmured, his voice a low gravel, devoid of its usual command. "The only one who can calm me." Elian did not respond. He could not. He simply knelt there, a living antidote, his world shrinking to the impossible warmth of the general's hand on his face, a silent confession hanging in the cold, sterile air between them. He was not an asset. He was an anchor. And he was terrified of what that truly meant. The world for Kalen Varus was noise, not sound, but a constant, overwhelming torrent of raw data, of stray emotions, of the psychic residue of every single soldier hard-linked into the Legion's neural command network. He was a conductor, the most powerful the consortium had ever produced. He could process battlefield telemetry from 1,000 perspectives simultaneously, could feel the adrenaline spike of a sniper lining up a shot and the slow, creeping fear of a scout in enemy territory. He could orchestrate death on a planetary scale with the speed of thought. It had made him a legend. It was also flaying his sanity raw, one mission at a time. The post-combat feedback was the worst. The echoes of death, the psychic screams of the fallen, both his own and the enemy's, would loop in his mind, a feedback spiral that overloaded every neural pathway. His body would become a prison for a mind under siege, resulting in the tremors, the pain, the bleeding from fragile vessels in his sinuses and ears. The Directorate's physicians had offered solutions, sedatives that dulled his strategic brilliance, inhibitors that deadened his connection but left his legion vulnerable. They were unacceptable compromises. He was a weapon, and a weapon could not be blunted. Then they had brought him the boy, Elian Rice. He remembered the first time, years ago. He had been thrashing in the containment field, lost in a phantom war, the ghosts of 100 dead soldiers whispering tactics in his ears. The door had hissed open, and a pale, slender young man in institutional greys had been pushed inside. He had looked terrified, a fawn thrown to a wolf. Kalen had snarled, a reflexive, primal rejection of another presence in his agony. But as the boy stepped closer, something impossible happened. The noise began to recede. The screaming whispers faded. The phantom data streams flickered and died. It was not a dampening. It was an erasure. A profound, shocking silence fell over his consciousness. A quiet he had not experienced since childhood, before his abilities had manifested. It was like surfacing from a crushing depth, the pressure vanishing, the world coming into sharp, singular focus. He had simply stared, his breath catching in his chest, as this boy, this anomaly, this null, stood before him, his mere existence a perfect antidote to Kalen's condition. He was not a cure. He was a reprieve, a temporary cessation of hostilities in the war Kalen fought against himself. Over the years, that reprieve had become a dependency, a weakness. He knew how Valerius and the others on the Directorate saw it. They saw Elian as a component, a biological regulator to keep their prized weapon functional. They logged every interaction, analyzed every biometric response. They measured the efficacy of Elian's presence in decimals and percentages. They did not understand what it felt like. They could not comprehend the solace of that. A quiet, the profound relief of being able to think a single, uninterrupted thought. Now, sitting on the plinth with the last of the tremors fading, the cool touch of Elian's skin under his thumb was the only thing that felt real. The rest, the chrome steel walls, the hum of the field, the silent judgment of the cameras, was part of the machine that contained them both. He watched Elian still kneeling before him, his head bowed, a picture of absolute submission. But Kalen saw the tension in his shoulders, the rigid control in his posture. This was not submission. It was endurance. Elian endured him. He endured this life. A flicker of something cold and possessive coiled in Kalen's gut. The Directorate thought Elian was their asset. They were wrong. The silence was his. Elian was his. He was not a component. He was a man. Kalen had spent years observing him, piecing together the person from the scant data available. He knew Elian read archaic paper books, a contraband luxury Kalen had arranged for him. He knew he favored tea over coffee. He knew the scent of his skin was not the sterile nothingness of the station, but something faintly organic, like old paper and clean soap. These were dangerous details, details that turned a tool into a person, a dependency into an attachment. He let his hand fall from Elian's face, the brief contact leaving a phantom warmth on his own skin. The formal distance slammed back into place, a wall of protocol between them. "Report," Kalen said, his voice regaining its familiar tone of command, cold and precise. He had to play the part. For the cameras, for the unseen observers. Elian rose smoothly to his feet, retreating to the regulation 3-foot distance. His face was a perfect mask of neutrality, his eyes cast downward. "Regulator 734 present and awaiting orders, General. Regulator 734. The designation was a deliberate cruelty, a reminder of his status. Kalen felt a muscle jump in his jaw. "The feedback has stabilized," Kalen stated, rising from the plinth. He felt weak, drained, but he forced strength into his posture, straightening to his full, imposing height. "Your function is complete. You are dismissed." Elian gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Yes, General." He turned and walked toward the door, his steps as silent and measured as they had been upon his arrival. He did not look back. Kalen watched him go, a strange ache settling in his chest. He was dismissing the only peace he had ever known. As the door hissed shut behind Elian, the silence in the chamber changed. It was no longer a shared sanctuary. It was just emptiness. The faint, ever-present hum of the station's life support seemed to grow louder, the first note in the returning symphony of noise. He was alone again, and the quiet was already starting to fray at the edges. He was not just a general. He was not just a conductor. He was a man with a fatal flaw, and that flaw had a name: Elian. The transition from the absolute zero of the general's containment chamber to the muted grey of the corridors was always jarring. Here, the silence was merely an absence of sound, not the profound psychic void Elian carried within him. He walked with his gaze fixed forward, his posture erect, betraying none of the trembling that lingered in his limbs. The touch still burned on his cheek, a phantom brand. It had been the first time. In 5 years of service as General Varus's regulator, there had been proximity, presence, the occasional accidental brush of hands during a transfer, but never a deliberate, gentle touch like that. It was a terrifying anomaly. It was a variable that the Directorate's equations could not account for, and Elian knew that anything they could not quantify, they sought to eliminate. His quarters were a small, windowless cube, identical to 1,000 others in the station's residential ring. A narrow bed, a small desk, a food dispenser, a data terminal. It was a cell furnished for efficiency, not comfort. He stripped off his grey uniform, the fabric stiff and impersonal, and placed it in the reclamation chute. The water in the sonic shower was precisely 38.6 degrees Celsius, the pressure algorithmically perfect for cleansing. It did nothing to wash away the feeling of the general's thumb stroking his skin. He dressed in a soft, dark blue tunic and trousers, a personal effect he was inexplicably allowed to keep. He suspected it was the general's doing, a small, unlogged gesture of, what? Humanity, possession. He didn't know which was more dangerous. He sat at his desk and activated the terminal. It offered him the standard array of approved media, historical consortium documentaries, technical manuals, strategic simulations. He ignored them all, instead pulling a flat, rectangular object from a hidden compartment beneath the desk's surface. It was a book, real paper, bound in worn synth leather. Meditations by an emperor of old Earth. Another of the general's gifts, smuggled to him by a tight-lipped logistics officer who studiously avoided eye contact. He opened it to a dog-eared page. The scent of aged paper and ink filled his small room, a grounding, organic smell in a world of sterile metal and recycled air. He read the words, but his mind was elsewhere. It was in the chrome steel chamber, kneeling on the cold floor. It was feeling the radiating agony of a man whose mind encompassed armies. The Directorate had found him on a remote agricultural outpost when he was 16. They had called his null field a gift, a chance to serve the consortium in a unique and vital capacity. They had not told him he would be a living tranquilizer, a prisoner whose only purpose was to keep a weapon from misfiring. He had been assigned to Kalen Varus a year later. The general had been a terrifying figure then, a legend whispered about in the training halls, a man who won wars before the first shot was fired. But Elian had quickly learned the legend was a facade built to hide the broken man beneath. He saw the vulnerability Kalen concealed from the universe, the agony he endured behind a mask of cold command. And in that shared vulnerability, a strange, unspoken bond had formed. It was not friendship. It was not Stockholm Syndrome. It was something more fundamental, a symbiotic reliance forged in trauma and silence. A guard entered his quarters without knocking, his presence a harsh intrusion. "The general requires you," the man said, his voice flat. His personal quarters. Elian's blood ran cold. The containment chamber was protocol. The general's private quarters were something else entirely. It had never happened before. He placed the book back in its hiding spot, his movements calm and deliberate, betraying none of his inner turmoil. Understood. The general's quarters were a stark contrast to the rest of the station. They were spacious, with a large viewport showing the star-dusted velvet of space and the gentle curve of the planet Xylos below. The lighting was warm, amber, not the harsh blue-white of the common areas. There was a large desk covered in datapads, a seating area with dark leather chairs and shelves filled with actual physical artifacts, a piece of crystalline rock, a polished alien skull, a collection of antique blades. It was the space of a man, not an asset. Kalen was standing by the viewport, dressed in a simple black uniform without the usual decorations and insignia. He did not turn as Elian entered. "They serve us a nutrient paste that has the texture of regret and the flavor of compliance," Kalen said, his voice a low murmur that was almost lost in the quiet hum of the room. "Tonight, we will have something else." He gestured to the low table between the chairs. On it was a tray with 2 plates of what looked like real food. Roasted avian meat, steamed greens, a portion of what might have been actual grain. The aroma was intoxicating, a ghost of a life Elian barely remembered. "Sit," Kalen commanded, though the word was softer than usual. Elian sat, his back ramrod straight, his hands folded in his lap. This was a test. Everything was a test. Kalen sat opposite him and pushed a plate forward. "Eat." They ate in silence. The food was incredible, each flavor a small explosion of novelty on a palate accustomed to engineered sustenance. Elian ate slowly, methodically, trying to commit the sensations to memory. The silence was different here. It was not the desperate, charged silence of the chamber. It was a comfortable quiet, a shared space free from the pressure of the storm. It was more intimate, and therefore more dangerous, than any physical touch. "What did you do before they found you?" Kalen asked, his voice startling Elian from his thoughts. It was the first personal question he had ever asked. Elian swallowed. He looked at the general, truly looked at him, for the first time, outside the context of a crisis. In the warm light, the lines of exhaustion around his eyes were more pronounced. He looked less like a living weapon and more like a weary man. "I worked in the archives," Elian said, his voice quiet. "At the orbital library over Cygnus X1. I catalogued old texts, paper ones." Kalen's silver eyes held his, a flicker of understanding. "Of course, that explained the books. Did you enjoy it?" "It was quiet," Elian replied, and the word held a universe of meaning for both of them. The silence was peaceful. Kalen nodded slowly, a small, almost imperceptible motion. "Yes." He looked away, back toward the starfield, outside the viewport. "Peace is a rare commodity in this galaxy, Regulator." He used the formal title, but the spell of their brief intimacy was not entirely broken. A line had been crossed. A small human connection had been forged in a place designed to stamp out such things. And as Elian looked at the powerful, lonely man sitting across from him, he felt a new, terrifying emotion stir within him, something more complex than fear or duty. It felt dangerously like empathy. The summons came not as a chime or a vocal command, but as a silent, insistent light pulsing on the wall of Elian's quarters, the insignia of the Directorate. His stomach twisted into a cold knot. It was never good news. The walk to the command spire was long, taking him through sectors of the station he rarely saw. Here, the utilitarian grey gave way to polished obsidian floors and walls of brushed metal. The personnel were different too, not soldiers in fatigues, but analysts and administrators in crisp, tailored uniforms, their faces impassive and their gazes sharp. They were the architects of the machine, the ones who saw men like him and Kalen as numbers on a balance sheet. Director Valerius's office was at the apex of the spire, its single vast window offering a god's-eye view of the station and the fleet docked around it. The room was minimalist, dominated by a large desk of black volcanic glass. Valerius himself was a small, neat man with thinning grey hair and eyes the colour of faded parchment. He smiled as Elian entered, a thin, dry expression that did not reach his eyes. "Regulator Race," he said, his voice soft, almost paternal. "Please come in. Sit." The use of his surname was a deliberate tactic, a performance of civility designed to disarm. Elian did not sit. He stood before the desk, assuming the formal position of attention. "Director." Valerius's smile did not falter. "So formal. There's no need for that between us. I consider you one of our most vital assets. Your performance has been exemplary." He gestured again to the chair, more insistently this time. Elian complied, perching on the very edge of the seat. The material was cold and unyielding. "I have good news," Valerius continued, steepling his fingers on the glass desk. "We are on the verge of a breakthrough, a new modification to the General's containment field, a biostatic dampener that should, in theory, replicate the effects of your null field, but with greater consistency and control." The words were calm, clinical, but they landed like blows. Replicate the effects. The unspoken corollary hung in the air between them. "And make you obsolete." Elian kept his face a perfect blank, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was it, the end of his usefulness. He thought of the files he had once glimpsed, the designations of other nulls, all listed as decommissioned. "That is excellent news for the General's well-being, Director," he managed, his voice steady. "Indeed." Valerius's pale eyes studied him, searching for a reaction, a crack in the facade. "It will free you from your demanding duties. Allow the consortium to find a new, perhaps more suitable, role for you." The threat was veiled in the language of corporate benevolence. A new role, decommissioning. They were one and the same. "I serve at the pleasure of the consortium," Elian said, the words tasting like ash. "Of course you do." Valerius leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping. "Tell me, Elian, the General. His attachment to you seems to be increasing. The logs show longer cool-down periods, requests for your presence outside of critical events. An unscheduled meal, I believe." The blood drained from Elian's face. They knew. Of course they knew. They saw everything. "The General's mental state is complex," Elian said carefully. "My presence appears to have a stabilizing effect even during periods of low-level neural stress." "A stabilizing effect," Valerius repeated, as if savoring the phrase. "Or is it a dependency? A vulnerability? A weapon like General Varus cannot afford vulnerabilities. human or otherwise. His function is to be precise, unwavering. Attachments create unpredictable variables. He paused, letting the silence stretch. You understand, don't you, the importance of maintaining operational purity? Elian understood perfectly. The Directorate didn't just want to manage Kalen's condition. They wanted to sever his humanity. They saw the bond between them, this fragile, unspoken thing, as a flaw in their weapon's design. They were going to correct it, and they were going to dispose of the flaw. Him. My only concern is the General's continued operational effectiveness, Director, Elian said, his voice a marvel of control. My personal feelings are irrelevant. Excellent, Valerius said, leaning back, the thin smile returning. That is precisely what I hoped to hear. We need our assets to be objective, dispassionate. He tapped a command into his desk, and a datapad slid toward Elian. This is the preliminary schedule for the upgrade installation. I trust you will continue to perform your duties admirably until it is complete. And you will. Of course, mention none of this to the General. We wouldn't want to cause him any undue anxiety. His focus needs to be on the upcoming fleet exercises. It was an order, a gag. He was to walk into the storm, day after day, knowing they were building a cage that would not only trap the General, but also sign his own death warrant. He was to comfort the man whose attachment to him was the very reason he was being discarded. The irony was a bitter, metallic taste in the back of his throat. Elian stood and took the datapad. Understood, Director. Good boy, Valerius said, dismissing him with a wave of his hand, already turning his attention to the star charts projected in the air above his desk. Elian walked out of the office, the datapad cold and heavy in his hand. The polite, paternal mask of the Directorate had slipped, and for the first time he had seen the chilling, impersonal calculus beneath. He was a variable, and he was about to be solved. He had to warn Kalen. He had to do something. For the first time in his life, the quiet, compliant prisoner felt the stirrings of a rebellion he never thought himself capable of. It was a terrifying, exhilarating feeling. It was the feeling of a man with nothing left to lose. Kalen stood before the tactical hollow table in the Legion's command center, the vast circular room thrumming with the quiet efficiency of his elite staff. A three-dimensional map of the Erebus sector glowed in the air, constellations and fleet vectors rendered in cool blue light. He was outlining the parameters for Operation Nightfall, the largest fleet exercise in a decade, but his mind was not on the intricate dance of simulated warships. It was on the subtle, almost imperceptible tremor in Elian's hand when he had delivered his evening meal tray an hour ago. It was on the shadowed, haunted look in his eyes that his carefully neutral expression could not quite conceal. Something was wrong. Kalen had felt it the moment Elian entered his quarters. The quiet that surrounded him, usually a soothing balm, had felt brittle, strained, as if it were a shield he was holding up with a great and terrible effort. General, Major Eva Rostova, his second in command, a sharp, unnervingly perceptive woman, broke his reverie. Your orders for the Third Fleet's deployment vector? Kalen focused on the map, the strategic part of his mind taking over with practiced ease. Shift their entry point to grid 075. Use the gas giant's magnetic field as cover for their initial approach. I want them silent. Yes, General. Rostova acknowledged, her fingers flying across her own console to implement the command. He finished the briefing, his voice the steady, unwavering instrument of command his officers expected. He dismissed them, but asked Rostova to remain. The command center emptied, leaving just the two of them in the glow of the star map. "What did Valerius want with my regulator?" Kalen asked, his voice low and devoid of inflection. Rostova didn't feign ignorance. She was too smart for that. She had access to station-wide personnel logs. "He was summoned to the director's office at 1400 hours, sir. The meeting lasted 17 minutes. The reason? The logs state it was a performance review, standard procedure for a high-value asset." Kalen's lips thinned. "There is nothing standard about Director Valerius or his procedures. Find out what they discussed. Use your private channels. I want the unredacted audio, the biometric readings, everything." "Sir, that's directorate-level clearance. Prying into Valerius's private logs is—" "An order, Major," Kalen finished, his voice dropping to a dangerous chill. "I am not asking for your opinion on its feasibility. I am telling you to accomplish it." Rostova met his gaze, her own dark eyes unwavering. She was one of the few people who was not intimidated by him. She was loyal to him, not to the consortium, a distinction Kalen had carefully cultivated. "It will take time," she said. "You have until 600, he replied, turning back to the map. "Dismissed." She left without another word. Kalen stared at the glowing map of the sector, but he wasn't seeing fleets or planets. He was seeing the cold, calculating face of Director Valerius. He saw the man's ambition, his obsession with control. Valerius viewed Kalen not as a person, but as a phenomenally powerful, regrettably unstable system. And any good systems analyst, when faced with an unpredictable variable, would seek to isolate and remove it. Elian was that variable. The director wanted to sever the connection, to put Kalen in a neat, technological box, free of messy human emotions and attachments, to turn him from a man who wielded a weapon into the weapon itself. A cold fury, clean and sharp as a shard of glass, settled in Kalen's chest. He had given everything to the consortium, his youth, his mind, his humanity. He had allowed them to mold him, to use him, to break him over and over again on the anvil of war. But Elian was not theirs to take. The dependency, he felt, was not a weakness. It was an anchor. It was the one thing that kept the last vestiges of Kalen Varus, the man, from being completely submerged by the general, the asset. Without that quiet space Elian provided, without that small human connection, the noise would consume him entirely. He would become the monster they whispered about in the lower decks, a walking apocalypse, a psychic storm with no eye. He would win their wars, and he would lose himself. He would not allow it. At 0547, his private comm chimed. It was Rostova. A data packet was transferred to his secure terminal. He opened it. The audio file was first. He listened to the entire 17-minute exchange, his face impassive, his posture rigid. He heard the paternalistic venom in Valerius's voice, the veiled threats, the cold dismissal. He heard the quiet, controlled terror in Elian's replies, the desperate effort to remain neutral, to give nothing away. A biostatic dampener, make you obsolete, a new, more suitable role. Decommissioned. The word screamed in the space between Valerius's carefully chosen euphemisms. Then Kalen opened the biometric file. He saw the spike in Elian's heart rate, the surge of cortisol in his blood, the minute, involuntary muscle contractions of a human being in a state of profound fear. And through it all, his voice had remained steady, his control was magnificent. A surge of fierce, protective pride washed through Kalen, so potent it almost made him dizzy. Valerius had threatened Elian. He had used Kalen's own well-being as the weapon. He had tried to turn Kalen's anchor into his executioner. The director had just made a grave miscalculation. He thought he was dealing with a loyal, if flawed, asset. He had forgotten that a cornered animal is the most dangerous kind. Kalen Varus was not an asset. He was the commander of the Legion. His loyalty was to his men and to the fragile peace he found in the presence of one quiet, unassuming archivist. And he would burn the consortium to the ground before he let anyone take that away. Operation Nightfall was no longer just a fleet exercise. It was about to become the cover for a rebellion. The following days were a study in controlled tension. On the surface, nothing changed. Elian continued his duties, appearing at the containment chamber or Kalen's quarters whenever summoned. He was a perfect model of compliance, his face a serene mask, his movements precise. Kalen, for his part, was the consummate general, his days consumed with the final preparations for Operation Nightfall, his manner with his staff as exacting and remote as ever. But beneath the surface, a silent, secret current was flowing between them. A new language was being born in the spaces between words, in held gazes and minute gestures. It began subtly. During a debriefing in Kalen's quarters, while ostensibly reviewing star charts, Kalen slid a datapad across the table to Elian. "Review these supply manifests for the outer colonies. I need a fresh perspective." The files were not manifests. They were technical schematics for the station's ventilation and power systems, maps of maintenance conduits and security sensor grids. There was no explanation. None was needed. Elian spent hours studying them, cross-referencing them with the station layouts he'd been given before, committing every junction and relay to memory. He was no longer just a regulator. He was becoming a student of his own prison. Kalen started leaving restricted data archives open on his terminal when Elian was present. "Organize these battle reports for me, regulator, chronologically." And within the reports of long-forgotten skirmishes were embedded files on Directorate personnel, security rotation schedules, and, most importantly, protocols for overriding automated lockdown procedures. They never spoke of it. To speak of it would be to give it a name, to make it real and detectable. Instead, they communicated through this clandestine curriculum. Kalen was the instructor, Elian the pupil. He was teaching Elian how to see the station not as a habitat, but as a machine that could be navigated, manipulated, and ultimately escaped. The lessons deepened their bond in ways their formal interactions never could. This was not about dependency or regulation. This was about trust. Kalen was trusting Elian with knowledge that could get them both executed. Elian was trusting that Kalen had a plan, a purpose behind these dangerous lessons. In the quiet of Kalen's quarters, surrounded by the ghosts of dead stars, they were no longer general and regulator. They were conspirators. One evening, the strain of their dual existence showed a crack. A mission to quell an uprising on a mining moon had gone badly for a detachment of the Fourth Fleet, not under Kalen's direct command. But as a conductor, he was sensitive to the network's traffic. He felt the distant echoes of panic and loss, a faint but persistent static at the edge of his perception. It was not enough to trigger a full-blown episode, but it left him frayed, his control stretched thin. He was sitting in one of the leather chairs, staring out the viewport, a glass of water untouched on the table beside him. Elian stood at the regulation distance, a silent sentinel. The static in Kalen's mind was a low, insistent buzz, like a trapped insect. He closed his eyes, trying to force it down, to wall it off. On impulse, he reached out with his mind, not to his soldiers, not to the network, but to the memory of Elian's silence. He focused on the feeling of that profound quiet, the memory of the pressure lifting. He tried to recreate the sensation, to manifest the void within himself. The effort was immense. A sharp pain lanced through his skull, and the buzz intensified, threatening to become a roar. He gasped, his hand flying to his temple. A tremor started in his fingers. Elian moved. He broke protocol without a command, stepping forward and placing a hand gently on Kalen's shoulder. The touch was firm, grounding, and with the physical contact, the silence he carried within him seemed to flow into Kalen, not as a memory, but as a present reality. The psychic buzz died instantly. The pain receded. Kalen opened his eyes, his breathing ragged. He looked up at Elian, who stood over him, his expression a mixture of concern and fear. "You should not have done that," Kalen said, his voice rough. "It is dangerous. The feedback could have—" "You were in pain," Elian interrupted, his own voice quiet but firm. He did not remove his hand. The warmth of it seeped through Kalen's uniform, a small point of contact in an ocean of isolation. In that moment, Kalen understood. Elian was not a passive instrument. He was not just a null field in human form. He was an active participant in their strange symbiosis. He could feel Kalen's distress, and he had chosen to act, to risk himself, to alleviate it. The Directorate believed they could replace him with a machine. They were fools. A machine could replicate the effect, but it could not replicate the choice. It could not offer comfort. It could not share the burden. Kalen reached up and covered Elian's hand with his own. His skin was cold, Elian's was warm. He held it there, on his shoulder, for a long moment. "Thank you," he said. The words were simple, inadequate, but they carried the weight of everything left unsaid. Elian gave a slight nod, his gaze locked with Kalen's. The fear in his eyes was still there, but it was joined by something else. Resolve. He was no longer just a prisoner enduring his fate. He was a partner in a rebellion he hadn't even known he'd joined. He was ready to fight. The knowledge was a comfort and a terror. Kalen was not just planning his own escape anymore. He was responsible for Elian's life. It was a burden he accepted without hesitation. He would not fail him. The archives were Elian's sanctuary and his obsession. Under the guise of organizing Kalen's personal logs, a task the general had assigned with a pointed look, he spent every spare moment delving into the consortium's vast, labyrinthine data network. He moved like a ghost through firewalls and security protocols, using the access codes Kalen had seeded for him, his past life as a cataloger giving him an intuitive understanding of the system's architecture. He was looking for leverage, for an escape route, for anything that could give them an edge. He started with the biostatic dampener, the machine Valerius intended to replace him with. He found the project files buried under 3 layers of military-grade encryption. The schematics were complex, a fusion of biomechanics and psionic engineering. But as he scrolled through the testing logs and output projections, a cold dread trickled down his spine. The device was not designed to soothe. It was designed to control. The dampener didn't just create a null field. It actively rewrote neural pathways. It targeted the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, the seats of personality, emotion, and higher reasoning. The log spoke of reducing emotional volatility and optimizing tactical response. It was a lobotomy, a precise technological scalpel that would carve away Kalen's humanity, leaving behind only the general, the perfect, unwavering, soulless weapon Valerius wanted. He would be a prisoner in his own mind, his consciousness locked away while the tactical machine wore his face and commanded his armies. The thought was so horrific, it made Elian physically ill. He leaned back from the terminal, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. This wasn't about making him obsolete. It was about turning Kalen into a monster that no longer needed a human anchor. Driven by a new, frantic urgency, he widened his search. He looked for his own designation, Regulator 734. His file was sparse, clinical. It detailed his capture, his training, his assignment to Kalen, but cross-referenced in a sub-file marked Project Chimera. Asset allocation was a list of other nulls. There were 6 of them. Regulator 113, assigned to a conductor in the Outer Rim fleets. Regulator 258, attached to a PSI core interrogator. One by one, he looked them up, and one by one, he found the same annotation next to their names. Decommissioned. The dates of their decommissioning corresponded precisely with the recorded deaths of their assigned conductors. The nulls weren't discarded when their conductors burned out. They were eliminated. They were loose ends, witnesses to the consortium's failed experiments. He was not just the general's anchor. He was the failsafe. The moment Kalen died, or was permanently altered by the new device, Elian would be erased. He was living on borrowed time, and the clock was about to run out. He felt a wave of dizzying vertigo, the cold, hard reality of his situation crashing down on him. He had always known he was a prisoner, a tool, but he had never understood the full, disposable nature of his existence. He was a component with a built-in expiration date. He pulled up Kalen's file next. It was vast, heavily redacted, but he found what he was looking for in the medical annexes. The neural degradation he suffered wasn't just a side effect of his power. It was a progressive disease. The consortium's best projections gave him 2 more years, maybe 3, before he suffered a catastrophic burnout, a complete and irreversible collapse of his cerebral functions. They knew he was dying. The biostatic dampener wasn't a cure. It was a way to squeeze the last drops of usefulness from their dying asset before he expired. They were going to hollow him out, use the shell until it broke, and then discard it. And Elian would be discarded right alongside him. The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture of such cold, pragmatic cruelty that it stole his breath. This was never about helping Kalen. It was about asset management. Kalen was not just fighting for his soul. He was fighting for his life, and he had been doing it alone for years. The rebellion, the secret lessons, the escape plan Kalen was surely formulating. It wasn't just to protect Elian. It was to save himself. Their fates were not just linked. They were one and the same. They would escape together, or they would be extinguished together. The fear that had been his constant companion for years did not vanish, but it was transformed. It crystallized from a paralyzing fog into a sharp, clear point of anger, a cold, defiant rage against the system that would grind them both into dust for the sake of efficiency. He was not a component. He was not a failsafe. He was a man. And General Kalen Varus, for all his power and his pain, was just a man too. He saved the files onto a shielded data chip, his movements swift and certain. He wiped the access logs, leaving no trace of his intrusion. The time for quiet compliance was over. The time for passive endurance was past. He walked out of the archives, the data chip burning a hole in his pocket, a fuse that had just been lit. He had to tell Kalen. They had to face this together. The prisoner was about to become a revolutionary. Elian found Kalen in the observation deck at the forward section of the command spire. It was a place they had never been together, a semi-public space, but it was late in the station's designated night cycle, and the vast, curved room was empty. Kalen stood before the transparent aluminum viewport, a solitary figure silhouetted against the swirling nebula of the Serpent's Coil. The view was majestic, a breathtaking vista of cosmic creation and destruction that made the station feel small and insignificant. He didn't turn as Elian approached, but his posture shifted slightly, acknowledging his presence. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Kalen said, his voice a low rumble. "All that chaos, all that energy, and from a distance, it looks like peace." Elian stopped beside him, his gaze following Kalen's out into the void. "From a distance," he agreed softly. He could feel the familiar, low-level static of Kalen's mind, the constant hum of his connection to the Legion. But there was something else beneath it tonight, a deep, resonant weariness. "I know," Elian said, his voice barely a whisper. The words hung in the air, simple, yet carrying the weight of his discovery. Kalen finally turned to look at him. The dim, ambient light of the nebula cast strange shadows on his face, making his silver eyes seem to glow. There was no surprise in his expression, only a profound, sad resignation. "You went into the archives." It wasn't a question. "I found the project files for the dampener," Elian said, his voice gaining strength. "I know what it does, what they plan to do to you." He reached into his pocket and held out the data chip. "I also found this, the others, the other nulls, and your medical prognosis." Kalen's gaze dropped to the chip in Elian's hand, then rose again to meet his eyes. For the first time, the formidable mask of the general slipped entirely, revealing the man beneath. The vulnerability Elian had only glimpsed during his episodes was now laid bare in the quiet darkness of the observation deck. He looked haunted. "I had hoped to spare you that knowledge," Kalen said, his voice raw. "To protect you from it until—" "Until what?" Elian pressed, stepping closer, his voice fierce with a newfound courage. "Until you spirited me away in the dead of night without telling me I was a dead man walking, without telling me we are on the same sinking ship." The carefully constructed walls of protocol and rank between them crumbled into dust. There was no general here, no regulator, just two men, trapped in the same gilded cage, staring their shared mortality in the face. "My protection has been a clumsy and inadequate thing," Kalen admitted, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I am a strategist, Elian. I see threats and I formulate counterattacks. I saw the threat to you, to us, and I began to move my pieces across the board. The lessons, the schematics, Operation Nightfall. It was all meant to be a path to our survival. I did not want to burden you with the why. The why is my burden to carry." "It is not just your burden anymore," Elian insisted, his voice shaking with the force of his emotion. "Don't you see? They're not just taking away my future. They're taking away your soul. I will not stand by and let that happen. I am not just a key to your cell, Kalen. I am in the cell with you." He used the general's name for the first time, It felt both blasphemous and profoundly right. Kalen stared at him, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant hum of the station and the faint, ghostly light of the nebula. "You were supposed to be a tool," Kalen said softly, a statement of fact laced with a deep, bitter irony. A simple, elegant solution to a complex problem. You were not supposed to have courage. "And you were supposed to be a weapon," Ilian countered, his voice softening. "Unthinking, unfeeling. You were not supposed to feel the need to protect anyone." A tremor ran through Kalen's hand. He clenched it into a fist at his side. The psychic static around him began to rise, the familiar precursor to a loss of control. The weight of the truth, spoken aloud, was threatening to overwhelm him. "The noise," he gritted out, squeezing his eyes shut. "It's getting louder." Without hesitation, Elian closed the remaining distance between them and took Kalen's clenched fist in both of his hands. The contact was electric. Elian's calm flowed into him, a cool, steadying river. He gently uncurled Kalen's fingers, lacing his own through them. The tremors subsided. The rising scream in Kalen's mind faded to a dull roar, then to a whisper, then to silence. He opened his eyes. They were standing so close he could feel the warmth of Elian's breath. He looked down at their joined hands. "You're the only one who can calm me," he said. But the words were different this time. They were not a growled statement of fact from a superior to his instrument. They were a confession, a raw, vulnerable admission of need from one man to another. "I know," Elian whispered, "and you are the only one who makes me want to fight." Kalen lifted his free hand and, for the second time in their lives, touched Elian's face. He cupped his jaw, his thumb stroking the line of his cheekbone. There were no cameras here, no observers, no directorate. Just the two of them against the backdrop of infinity. "Operation Nightfall begins in 48 hours, Kalen said, his voice low and intense. "The station will be on high alert, but all eyes will be on the simulation. It will be our only chance. The chaos will be our cover." "What do we do?" Elian asked, his heart pounding. "I will command the exercise from the bridge. The chaos I create there will be real. I will cripple the station's internal security, communications, and tracking systems from the inside. It will look like a cascading system failure caused by the simulation's feedback. It will be my final act as General of the Legion." He paused, his silver eyes boring into Elian's. "Your role is more difficult. You must get from your quarters to Hangar Bay 7, alone. I will clear the path for you, but there will be guards, lockdowns. You will have to use everything I have taught you." "And you?" Elian asked, his voice tight with fear for the other man. "How will you get to the hangar?" "I won't," Kalen said grimly. "I will bring the hangar to me." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Elian understood. Kalen was going to use his final moments of command to tear a hole in the station's defenses big enough for them to slip through. He was going to burn it all down behind them. It was a desperate, suicidal plan. It was their only hope. "We do this together," Ilian said. "A vow." Kalen's expression softened. "Together." He leaned in, and for a heart-stopping moment, Elian thought he was going to kiss him. Instead, he rested his forehead against Elian's. The contact was overwhelmingly intimate. They stood there for a long time, two fugitives silhouetted against the stars, drawing strength from each other, their pact sealed in the quiet dark. The 48 hours leading up to Operation Nightfall passed in a state of surreal calm. The station was a hive of activity, personnel rushing to their posts, the comms network buzzing with pre-exercise chatter. But for Elian and Kalen, the world had narrowed to a sharp, singular focus. They were the eye of the hurricane, a pocket of intense quiet at the center of a gathering storm. They met one last time in Kalen's quarters, not as conspirators, but as two men sharing a final, stolen moment of peace. They did not speak of the plan. They did not speak of the danger. Instead, Kalen showed Elian how to brew tea using actual leaves from a small, lacquered box. The ritual was slow, deliberate, each movement precise. It was a lesson in patience, in focus, a final gift. When the time came, Kalen donned his full dress uniform, the obsidian fabric heavy with medals and insignia. He was once again the formidable General Varus, the living weapon of the consortium. The transformation was chilling. He looked at Elian, his face an impassive mask, but his eyes conveyed a different message. Be ready. Then he was gone, leaving Elian alone in the quiet warmth of the room. The moment. The door hissed shut. Elian began to move. He changed into a dark utility jumpsuit he had acquired, the fabric durable and non-reflective. He strapped a small toolkit to his thigh and slipped the data chip into a sealed pocket. He was no longer a regulator. He was an operative. He was a survivor. The station's chronometer chimed, signaling the start of the exercise. A moment later, the station's primary lights dimmed, replaced by the red glow of combat alert lighting. A synthesized voice echoed through the corridors. Operation Nightfall has commenced. This is a simulation. All non-essential personnel report to designated safe zones. The chaos was about to begin. Elian slipped out of Kalen's quarters. The corridors were a frantic river of personnel moving in the opposite direction. He hugged the walls, a grey shadow in the crimson gloom, moving against the current. He had the station's schematics burned into his memory, a complex three-dimensional map. His target was a maintenance conduit 3 levels down. On the bridge, Kalen stood on the command dais, a monolith of calm amidst controlled chaos. The main holotank before him was a maelstrom of light and data as two fleets, his legion and their simulated opponent, clashed in the void. His officers called out reports, their voices tight with focus. Enemy fleet has broken through our forward screen. Sector Gamma is collapsing. Shields on the Vindicator are at 12%. They're taking heavy fire. Kalen issued orders with cold, inhuman speed. Reroute auxiliary power to the Vindicator's shields. Task Force Omega. Execute pincer maneuver 3 Delta. I want those cruisers neutralized. But while his voice commanded the simulated battle, his mind was elsewhere. He was weaving a second set of commands into the network, a virulent code hidden within the massive data streams of the war game. It was a digital ghost moving through the station's core systems, targeting security, comms, and internal transport. He felt the station's AI trying to fight him, a primitive intelligence sensing a foreign presence. He brushed it aside with a wave of focused psychic energy, a move that sent a sharp spike of pain through his temples. He ignored it. He was a conductor. He could command more than just men. He could command the machine. A piercing alarm suddenly blared through the bridge. A red light flashed on a secondary console. "Sir," a tech officer yelled, "we have a cascading failure in the internal sensor grid. I've lost feeds from sectors Alpha through Epsilon." "It's feedback from the simulation's energy weapon discharge," Kalen said, his voice a convincing lie. isolate the damaged sectors, focus on the battle. He was building the narrative, creating the illusion of an accident. As he spoke, he reached out with his mind and severed the primary comms relay. The bridge was plunged into an eerie silence, broken only by the now useless shouts of his officers. In the maintenance conduit, Elian felt the deck plates vibrate as a series of heavy blast doors slammed shut. Kalen's lockdown. He checked the datapad Kalen had given him. A single green line pulsed on the schematic, showing a clear path through the deactivated security fields. Kalen was guiding him. He crawled through the cramped, dark space, the scent of dust and ozone thick in the air. He could hear the muffled sounds of confusion from the corridors below, the shouts of guards trying to make sense of the system failures. He was an unseen ghost in the station's arteries. Back on the bridge, Director Valerius's face appeared on Kalen's private comm, the only channel Kalen had left open. The director's face was a mask of fury. "General, what is the meaning of this? Cease the exercise at once. You are crippling the station." "I'm afraid I can't do that, Director," Kalen said, a cold, thin smile touching his lips. "Operation Nightfall is proceeding exactly as planned." He pushed his power to its absolute limit. The pain was blinding. Blood began to leak from his nose, dripping onto the pristine collar of his uniform. He reached deep into the station's power grid and found what he was looking for: the magnetic clamps holding the auxiliary shuttle, Nomad, in Hangar Bay 7. With a final, agonizing surge of will, he overloaded the entire hangar control system. He didn't just unlock the clamps, he blew them. Alarms screamed across the station, real ones this time. The simulated battle on the holotank vanished, replaced by a single, stark warning: hull breach imminent, Hangar Bay 7. Elian emerged from the conduit into a deserted service corridor just outside the hangar. The air was vibrating with the shriek of alarms. The massive hangar doors were screeching open, their emergency protocols overridden. He saw the Nomad, a small, long-range scout ship, its docking clamps sparking and snapping as they failed. Kalen had not just opened the door, he had ripped it off its hinges. The plan had changed. Kalen wasn't just creating a diversion. He was creating an emergency so severe that a single escaping shuttle would be the least of the station's worries. But the cost. Elian sprinted toward the shuttle ramp, his lungs burning. On the bridge, Kalen swayed, his vision blurring. He had expended nearly everything. He could feel Valerius's guards trying to cut through the bridge's blast doors. He had only seconds left. He sent one last thought out, not through the network, but as a raw, psychic broadcast aimed at the one mind that could hear it. "Go, Elian. Live." Then he turned to face the door, his hand resting on the hilt of the ceremonial blade at his belt. He would not be taken alive. He was General Kalen Varus of the Legion. He would die on his feet. On the ramp of the Nomad, Elian stumbled, a wave of agony and despair crashing over him. Kalen's agony. He heard the final, desperate message in his mind. No, he would not leave him. He slammed his hand on the shuttle's cockpit control panel, his mind racing. He couldn't go back for him. But maybe he could bring the hangar to Kalen in a different way. He saw the hangar's fire suppression system, the massive tanks of deoxygenating foam. It was a crazy, desperate idea. It was the only one he had. He bypassed the shuttle's launch sequence and hacked into the station's emergency systems, his fingers flying with a speed born of desperation. He didn't just activate the fire suppression, he ruptured the tanks, all of them. The bridge doors exploded inward in a shower of molten metal. Director Valerius stormed in, flanked by a squad of heavily armed security guards. They found General Kalen Varus standing alone on the command dais, a thin line of blood tracing a path from his nose to his chin, his hand on his sword. He looked exhausted, broken, but his silver eyes burned with defiant fire. "It's over, Kalen," Valerius snarled, his composure shattered, replaced by pure rage. "You have failed. The shuttle is still in the bay. Your pet is trapped. You will surrender now, and I will take immense pleasure in dismantling you piece by piece." Kalen offered a weak, bloody smile. "You still don't understand, Director. You see the board, but you don't understand the players." At that moment, a new alarm shrieked, this one higher, more frantic than the others. A voice, ragged with panic, yelled from a functioning comms station. "Sir, massive pressure failure in the hangar bay's fire suppression system. The foam tanks, they've all ruptured. The entire bay is flooding." Valerius's head whipped around. Flooding? With what? But he already knew. A thick, white wave of fire-suppressant foam, dense and fast-moving, erupted from the hangar bay, propelled by the force of the ruptured tanks. It was a silent, suffocating tsunami, pouring into the service corridors, engulfing everything in its path. It was not a weapon of destruction, but of chaos. A perfect, blinding, sensor-proof smokescreen. And it was moving toward the command spire. On the Nomad, Elian worked frantically, the cockpit filling with the reflected white glare. He had rerouted the shuttle's short-range sensors, tuning them to a single, unique biometric signature, Kalen's. He had turned the ship into a rescue beacon. He activated the external grapples and the tractor beam, setting them to lock onto that signature and that signature alone. Then he fired the engines. The Nomad didn't launch. It lurched forward, fighting against the remnants of its docking clamps, and plowed directly into the interior wall, separating the hangar from the main station infrastructure. It was a battering ram. The screech of tortured metal was deafening as the shuttle's reinforced prow tore through the bulkhead, creating a new, violent exit from the hangar bay. It carved a path of destruction through service corridors and storage bays, following the only guide it had, the pulsing location of Kalen Varus. It was a move of such insane audacity that no one could have predicted it. Kalen felt the station shudder around him. He saw the astonishment and terror on Valerius's face, and he understood. Elian hadn't run. He had improvised. He had turned his own escape into a rescue mission. A fierce, wild hope surged through Kalen, giving him a last burst of strength. He drew his blade, its monomolecular edge humming in the stale air of the bridge. "For the Legion," he roared, and charged. The guards, caught between the oncoming foam and the legendary general, hesitated for a fatal second. Kalen moved through them like a phantom, his blade a blur of silver light. He was not just a psychic. He was a master swordsman, a fact the Directorate, in their focus on his psionic abilities, had forgotten. He carved a path toward the bridge's rear exit, the one that led toward the shuttle's trajectory. Behind him, the first wave of white foam poured onto the bridge, obscuring everything, silencing the shouts and the panic. He burst into the corridor just as the prow of the Nomad tore through the far wall in a cataclysmic explosion of metal and wiring. The ship's ramp slammed down scant feet from him. The cockpit canopy hissed open, and Elian was there, his face pale and grim, his hand outstretched. "Kalen!" Kalen staggered forward, his body screaming in protest, the adrenaline fading. He grasped Elian's hand, the contact a lifeline. Elian pulled him aboard, his wiry frame surprisingly strong. As the ramp began to rise, Kalen looked back. He saw Director Valerius emerging from the foam, his face a mask of disbelief and hatred. Kalen met his gaze one last time, and then the ramp sealed, plunging them into the dim light of the shuttle's interior. Elian was already in the pilot's seat, the controls flashing around him. "Hold on," was all he said. The Nomad's engines roared, and the shuttle reversed, pulling itself free from the wound it had carved in the station. It pivoted in the foam-filled hangar and shot out into the void, a tiny spark of defiance against the backdrop of the crippled, screaming station. They were free. Kalen collapsed into the co-pilot's seat, the last of his strength deserting him. The psychic backlash from his efforts, combined with his physical wounds, was a crushing weight. The noise, held at bay for so long, came rushing back, a tidal wave of pain. He cried out, his body convulsing. Elian unstrapped himself and was at his side in an instant. He didn't hesitate. He pulled Kalen's head into his lap, his hands stroking his hair, his cheek pressed against Kalen's temple. He wrapped his silence around Kalen's shattered mind, a gentle, healing blanket. He did not speak. He just held him, absorbing the storm, calming the tremors. The power dynamic had completely inverted. The fearsome general was broken, helpless. The quiet regulator was now the protector, the pilot, the caretaker. Adrift in the silent vastness of space, hunted and alone, they had nothing left but each other. Kalen's convulsions slowly subsided. The pain in his mind receded, leaving behind a vast, aching emptiness. He looked up at Elian, his vision blurry. He saw not a null, not a regulator, but his anchor, his partner, his salvation. He reached up, his hand trembling, and cupped Elian's cheek. "Elian," he whispered, the name a prayer. Elian leaned down and gently pressed his lips to Kalen's forehead, a gesture of profound tenderness, a promise made in the silence between stars. The future was a blank, uncharted map. The consortium would hunt them. They were fugitives, with no allies and no destination. But as the Nomad sped away into the deep dark, a tiny vessel carrying 2 broken men, they were not afraid. They had found their freedom not in escaping the cage, but in finding the one person they wanted to be caged with. The silence in the cockpit was no longer an absence. It was a presence. It was peace. It was home.